The champagne hit her face before she could blink. Cold, humiliating, in front of 300 of New York's most powerful people. Her husband stood over her laughing, calling her crazy, telling everyone she was unstable. She was 8 months pregnant, sitting alone at the worst table in the room, covered in expensive wine and cheap insults. He thought she was nobody, a poor orphan girl he had rescued from nothing. He had no idea that the 3 men who just walked through those doors were her brothers. He had no idea they were billionaires. And he definitely had no idea that in the next 48 hours, they would destroy everything he had ever built. But here is what nobody expected. The brothers did not save her. She saved herself. This is the story of Grace Sullivan, a woman who built a $40 million company, lost everything to a predator in a suit, and then burned his empire to the ground while 9 months pregnant. Stay until the end. The twist in the final 10 minutes will change how you see every relationship you have ever been in. Value statement. Before we begin, I want you to know something important. This is not just entertainment. Hidden inside this story are 8 real strategies that abuse survivors use to escape, rebuild, and fight back. Pay attention. You might need them someday, or someone you love might. Now, let us begin. Story meaning plus lesson. Trans. What a journey. Grace started this story practicing how to smile in a mirror, hiding bruises under makeup, believing she was trapped forever. She ended it running a foundation that has helped thousands of women escape the same nightmare. Here's the lesson. The most dangerous predators do not look like monsters. They look like knights in shining armor. They listen. They wait. They become exactly what you need. And by the time you realize what they are, you are already in the cage. But cages have keys. And sometimes, the key is simply refusing to stay silent. If you learned something from this story, if it made you think, if it made you feel, then you already know what to do. Grace Sullivan stood before the full-length mirror in the master bedroom, practicing how to smile. The reflection staring back at her was almost unrecognizable. Her eyes, once bright with the fire of a woman who had built a $40 million company from nothing, now carried the hollow exhaustion of someone who had forgotten what safety felt like. She was 8 months pregnant, her belly straining against the navy blue silk of her custom gown. But the weight she carried was far heavier than the child growing inside her. She tilted her chin upward, examining the artistry of her deception. The bruises on her upper arms, fresh from 2 nights ago when Parker had grabbed her for speaking too loudly on the phone, were invisible beneath 3 layers of concealer and the strategic placement of a cashmere wrap. She had become an expert at this particular magic trick. Hide the evidence, perform the role, survive another day. I used to tell other women to just leave, she thought, adjusting a strand of hair that had fallen loose. I built an entire app to help them escape. I raised $30 million because I believed it was simple. Pack a bag, walk out the door, start over. Now she understood the cruel joke of that advice. Leaving was not a door. It was a maze with walls that moved every time you thought you had found the exit. And Parker Mitchell was the architect who kept redesigning the labyrinth. The bedroom door swung open without warning. Grace flinched before she could stop herself, her hand flying instinctively to her pregnant belly. In a protective gesture that had become automatic over the past 2 years, Parker stood in the doorway, adjusting his cufflinks with the casual precision of a man who had never doubted his place in the world. He was handsome in the way that expensive things are handsome, polished, maintained, utterly devoid of warmth beneath the gleaming surface. His tuxedo was Italian wool, tailored to perfection, and his smile was the same one that had graced the cover of Forbes magazine 18 months ago under the headline Philanthropist of the Year. That smile had fooled everyone, including her. "Are you ready yet?" Parker asked, his tone carrying the familiar edge that preceded something worse. "Or do I have to drag you to the car?" "We are already 15 minutes behind schedule, Grace." 15 minutes. Do you have any idea how that looks? "I am ready," Grace said softly. She turned to face him, her practiced smile firmly in place. "I was just finishing my makeup." Parker's eyes traveled over her body. With the cold assessment of a man inspecting merchandise he regretted purchasing, his gaze lingered on her swollen stomach, and his lip curled with undisguised disgust. "You look enormous," he said flatly. "That dress was supposed to be slimming. You look like a whale wrapped in a tablecloth." Grace swallowed the response that burned in her throat. She had learned, through painful repetition, that defending herself only made things worse. "It is our child, Parker. I am pregnant. The doctor says I am measuring exactly where I should be." "The doctor?" Parker repeated mockingly. He crossed the room to grab his watch from the dresser, moving past her as though she were furniture. "The doctor is paid to tell you what you want to hear. I am telling you the truth. You are an embarrassment. Try to stand behind me tonight. I have investors from Goldman Sachs attending this gala, and I cannot afford to have you waddling around like some kind of circus attraction." 2 years ago, those words would have shattered her. Now they simply added another crack to a foundation that was already crumbling. Grace watched her husband spray a cloud of expensive cologne into the air and walk through it, choking the space between them with artificial scent. "The Sapphire Gala," Parker continued, checking his reflection with far more care than he had ever shown her. "This is the biggest networking event of the year. Everyone who matters will be there. Your job is simple. Sit at the table. Do not speak unless someone asks you a direct question. Smile when appropriate. And for the love of God, do not mention that ridiculous app you used to run. Nobody wants to hear about domestic violence at a cocktail party." Grace felt her fingernails digging into her palms. The app. Her app. The one she had built from nothing after her college roommate, Jennifer, had been murdered by an abusive ex-boyfriend. The app that had helped over 200,000 women safely document abuse, find resources, and plan their escapes. The app she had sold for $40 million because she wanted to prove she could be more than her success. She had wanted to be loved for herself, not for her money, not for her connections, not for the Kensington Foundation her brothers had built with her investment. She had wanted someone to see Grace Sullivan, the woman, not Grace Sullivan, the tech millionaire with 3 overprotective brothers who happened to be billionaires. Parker Mitchell had seemed like the answer to that prayer. He had found her volunteering at a literacy program, anonymous and ordinary. He had bought her coffee, asked about her favorite books, listened with what seemed like genuine interest when she talked about her dreams of making a difference without the weight of wealth attached to her name. She had fallen in love with being normal. She had fallen in love with the idea that someone could want her without knowing what she was worth. The cruelest discoveries always come after the rings are exchanged. "The car is waiting," Parker announced, pocketing his phone. "And fix your hair. You have a strand loose. You look like a washerwoman who wandered into the wrong party." Grace reached up with trembling fingers, tucking the offending curl behind her ear. She caught her reflection one final time in the mirror and saw a stranger looking back. Somewhere beneath the concealer and the practiced smile, beneath the fear and the exhaustion, a small ember still glowed. She had not told Parker about her brothers. She had not told him about the $40 million sitting in trust accounts he could not touch. She had not told him that the phone hidden in the bottom of her makeup bag was a direct line to 3 men who would burn the world down to protect her. She had kept those secrets because she wanted to believe love was possible without leverage. Tonight, she was beginning to understand that some men only respond to power. Just get through tonight, she told herself, as she followed Parker toward the elevator. Just one more night. She had no way of knowing that this particular night would change everything. The limousine glided through the rain-slicked streets of Manhattan, its tinted windows transforming the city lights into blurred watercolors. Grace sat as far from Parker as the leather seat would allow, her hands folded protectively over her belly, watching the familiar landmarks pass like memories from another life. Central Park, the Metropolitan Museum, the corner coffee shop where Parker had first asked for her phone number. That coffee shop felt like it existed in a different universe now, a universe where she had been naive enough to believe in fairy tales. "Stop slouching," Parker said without looking up from his phone. "You look like a sack of potatoes. Sit up straight." Grace adjusted her posture automatically, wincing as the movement sent a sharp pain through her lower back. She had been on her feet all morning, forbidden from hiring help because Parker considered household staff an unnecessary expense, despite the penthouse they occupied being worth $14 million. "Parker," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, "my back has been hurting all day. The doctor said I should not be on my feet for an extended period. Could we perhaps stay at the gala for just an hour or two and then come home early?" Parker finally looked up from his phone, his expression shifting from indifference to contempt. "An hour or two," he laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "I paid $50,000 for a table at this event, Grace. $50,000. Do you have any concept of what that means? We will stay until I decide we leave. We will stay until I have spoken to everyone I need to speak to. We will stay until I say otherwise. Is that clear?" "Yes," Grace whispered. "That is clear. Good." Parker returned his attention to his phone. "And stop asking stupid questions. You do nothing all day except sit in that penthouse eating food that I pay for. The least you can do is stand beside me for a few hours without complaining like a child." Grace turned her face toward the window so he would not see the tears gathering in her eyes. She blinked them back with practiced efficiency. Crying was not permitted. Crying made her weak. Crying gave him ammunition. "If you are going to be emotional," Parker added, as if reading her thoughts, "do it now. Get it out of your system. I will not have you embarrassing me at the gala with red eyes and a runny nose. The wives of powerful men do not cry in public." The wives of powerful men. Grace almost laughed at the irony. If Parker knew the truth about her family, about what she had walked away from, about the phone calls she had been ignoring for 3 years, his entire understanding of their marriage would collapse. Her brothers had tried to warn her. Marcus, the eldest, had run a background check on Parker within 48 hours of their first date. He had found the debts, the failed business ventures, the pattern of short relationships that ended abruptly and badly. He had begged Grace not to rush into anything. Derek, the middle brother, had offered to buy Parker off, $1 million to walk away and never contact her again. Grace had been furious at the suggestion. Evan, the youngest, had simply asked her one question that still haunted her. "Are you running toward him or away from us?" She had not answered because she knew the truth would hurt them. She was running away from the weight of being a Sullivan, away from the expectations, away from the guilt of having more money than she could ever spend while women like her college roommate died because they could not afford to escape. She had wanted to be ordinary, to prove that she could survive without the safety net of billions. Now she was trapped in a cage of her own construction, and the man who held the key had no idea that the lock was not as secure as he believed. The limousine pulled up to the Pierre Hotel. its grand entrance blazing with light despite the rain. Photographers lined the red carpet, their cameras flashing like lightning strikes. Valets in crisp uniforms rushed to open doors for the arriving guests. Parker straightened his tie and checked his reflection in the tinted divider between them and the driver. "Remember what I told you," he said. "Smile, do not speak, stay out of the way, and try not to look so miserable. People will think I beat you or something." He laughed at his own joke. Grace did not laugh. They exited the limousine together, Parker's hand clamping around her upper arm with bruising force as he steered her toward the entrance. To the observers and photographers, it might have looked protective. Loving, even. Only Grace knew that his grip was a warning. Do not embarrass me. Do not speak out of turn. Do not be anything other than what I need you to be. The grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel was a masterpiece of excess. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls. Waiters in white gloves circulated with trays of champagne and caviar. A string quartet played softly in the corner, their elegant music nearly drowned out by the roar of conversation and performative laughter. Everyone who mattered in New York society was here. Hedge fund managers and their trophy wives. Real estate moguls comparing properties like baseball cards. Tech entrepreneurs who had made their first billion before turning 30. Philanthropists whose generosity always seemed to coincide with tax season. Grace knew this world. She had grown up adjacent to it, watching her brothers navigate its treacherous waters while she dreamed of something simpler, something real. Instead, she had married a man who saw her as a prop in his performance of success. Parker scanned the room with the hungry eyes of a predator selecting targets. "There," he said, releasing her arm with a dismissive push. "Table 12. Near the kitchen. Go sit down and stay there. I see James Whitmore by the bar, and I need to talk to him about a shipping contract." Grace stumbled slightly, catching herself on a nearby pillar. "Will you bring me a water?" she asked. "I am feeling a little dizzy." Parker was already walking away. "There are waiters everywhere, Grace. Use your brain." She watched him cross the ballroom, his demeanor transforming the moment he reached his first target. The cruel sneer vanished, replaced by a warm, charismatic smile. He clapped James Whitmore on the back like an old friend. He laughed at something another man said with the easy confidence of someone who belonged. This was his true talent. Not business, not leadership. Deception. Parker Mitchell could become whatever the situation required, shedding personalities like a snake sheds skin. Grace made her way through the crowd slowly, conscious of the eyes that followed her. In this circle, pregnancy was treated like a temporary disfigurement. The other women, poured into gowns that left nothing to imagination, examined her with barely concealed judgment. "Is that Parker Mitchell's wife?" she heard one woman whisper to another. "God, she is massive. He must be mortified. I heard she was nobody before he married her. Some kind of charity case." Grace kept her head down and found table 12. It was positioned exactly where she expected, near the kitchen doors, the cheapest location in the room. Parker had paid $50,000 for the appearance of generosity while spending as little as possible on the actual experience. She lowered herself into a chair, relief washing over her swollen ankles, and signaled a passing waiter for water. Then she sat alone, watching her husband work the room, and wondered how her life had come to this. There is something you should know if you have ever found yourself in a situation like Grace's. The isolation is intentional. Abusers do not start with violence. They start with distance. They separate you from friends, from family, from anyone who might notice the changes. They convince you that your people do not understand, that only they truly know you, that asking for help would be a betrayal of the sacred bond between you. By the time the first bruise appears, you are already alone, Grace had built an app designed to break that isolation. She had raised $30 million to fund escape routes and support systems. She had given speeches about recognizing the warning signs, and she had missed every single one of them in her own marriage. That is how good the predators are. They do not hunt randomly. They study. They wait. They identify exactly what you need to hear, and then they become the person who says it. Parker Mitchell had researched Grace Sullivan before their first meeting. He had known about her company, her wealth, her desperate desire to be loved for herself rather than her money. He had given her exactly what she wanted, and then he had taken everything else. 45 minutes passed, then an hour. Grace sat at table 12, invisible and forgotten, watching the party swirl around her like a storm she could not escape. She had managed to drink 2 glasses of water and eat a few crackers from the breadbasket. The baby kicked periodically, a reminder that whatever happened tonight, she was fighting for more than herself. She placed her hand on her stomach and felt the movement beneath her palm. "I will get us out of this," she promised silently. "I just need a little more time." The string quartet shifted into a new piece and the dance floor began to fill with couples. Grace watched Parker lead a blonde woman in a silver dress toward the center of the room. She recognized her immediately. Tiffany Lawson, Parker's executive assistant for the past 6 months. The affair had been obvious for weeks. The late nights at the office, the mysterious charges on the company card for hotels Grace had never visited, the way Parker's phone was suddenly password protected after years of lying carelessly around the penthouse. Grace had suspected. She had even confronted him once, gently, carefully, the way you approach a wild animal that might bite. Parker had laughed in her face. He had called her paranoid, hormonal, crazy. He had asked if she needed to go back to the hospital, where she had spent 3 days 6 months ago, after a breakdown he had deliberately triggered. That was his ultimate weapon. The medical records. The diagnosis of anxiety and depression that any reasonable person would develop after 2 years of systematic abuse. The documents she had signed while sedated, not understanding that she was signing away control of her own life. "If you leave me," Parker had said that night, "I will have you committed. I will take the baby. I will tell everyone you were unstable all along. And who will believe you? The crazy woman who married a man she barely knew and then accused him of abuse, please? I am the one who funds the domestic violence shelter downtown. I gave the keynote speech at the Women in Business Conference last spring. I am the feminist ally. You are the hysterical pregnant woman with a history of mental illness. Check and mate." Grace watched him now, dancing with Tiffany, his hand resting on the small of her back, with an intimacy he had not shown his wife in over a year. He was not even trying to hide it. He was rubbing her face, in it, here, at the most public event of the social calendar, while his pregnant wife sat alone by the kitchen doors. The humiliation burned hot in her chest, but beneath it, something else was kindling, something that felt almost like anger. Movement at the main entrance caught her attention. The massive double doors swung open, admitting a gust of cold air that seemed to cut through the humid warmth of the ballroom. Usually late arrivals slipped in quietly, embarrassed by their tardiness. This was different. 3 men walked in, and the energy in the room shifted like a tide changing direction. They were dressed in black tuxedos that cost more than most people made in a year. They moved with a synchronized purpose that suggested military training or something equally dangerous. The man in the center was the tallest, with broad shoulders and dark hair, his eyes scanning the room with the cold efficiency of a predator assessing threats. The string quartet actually faltered for a beat. "Who are they?" someone whispered at the table next to Grace. "Are you serious?" Another voice replied. trembling with something between awe and fear. That is Marcus Sullivan. The one on the left is Derek Sullivan, and the young one is Evan Sullivan. They are the Sullivan brothers. They run the Kensington Foundation. They basically own half of the shipping industry and a quarter of the hedge funds in New York. I heard they bought the entire media company last month just to fire one editor who wrote a negative article about their family. Grace's heart stopped. Her brothers. They were supposed to be in London. Derek had sent a text 3 weeks ago saying something about a conference in Switzerland. Marcus never traveled during hurricane season because his security firm had government contracts that required his presence. Evan had just started a new civil rights case that was supposed to keep him in California for months. They were not supposed to be here, but they were here, and they were scanning the room with expressions that made Grace's blood run cold. She gripped the tablecloth so hard her knuckles turned white. How? How had they known? She had been so careful. She had ignored their calls, deleted their messages, maintained the fiction that everything was fine, that she was happy, that she had made the right choice. The answer came to her in a flash of understanding. Monica, her best friend, the only person she had trusted with even a fraction of the truth. Monica Harper, who worked as an ER nurse and had seen the bruises during Grace's last visit. Monica, who had begged her to tell her brothers, to accept help, to stop pretending. Monica had betrayed her, or saved her. Grace was not yet sure which. Marcus whispered something to a hostess near the entrance. The woman's face went pale, and she pointed a trembling finger toward the back of the room, toward table 12. The brothers began to move. Parker, oblivious to the approaching storm, was still on the dance floor with Tiffany. He had his back to the entrance. He had not noticed the whispers spreading through the crowd like wildfire. He had not seen the 3 most powerful men in the room heading toward his wife. He did, however, notice when James Whitmore, the investor he had been trying to impress all night, suddenly excused himself and moved rapidly toward the bar with an expression of barely contained alarm. Parker's survival instincts kicked in. He released Tiffany and turned toward the commotion, his eyes scanning for the source of the disruption. His gaze landed on the Sullivan brothers. For a moment, Grace watched her husband's face cycle through recognition, calculation, and opportunity. He did not know who they were to her. He only knew they were rich, powerful. Exactly the kind of connection he had been desperate to make. Parker straightened his tie and intercepted the brothers in the middle of the dance floor. The room held its collective breath. "Mr. Sullivan," Parker said, his voice projecting that artificial warmth he wore like a costume. "Parker Mitchell, Mitchell Logistics. I have been trying to get a meeting with your procurement team for months. I think we could offer you rates that would significantly improve your supply chain efficiency." Marcus Sullivan did not break stride. He did not look at Parker's extended hand. He did not acknowledge his existence in any way. He simply walked through the space Parker occupied, forcing him to stumble backward to avoid being trampled. "Out of my way," Marcus said. His voice was a low rumble that carried across the silent ballroom like thunder. Parker's face flushed a deep, ugly crimson. The rejection had been public, brutal, total. Scattered giggles erupted from the watching crowd. Tiffany, standing nearby, took a visible step backward, distancing herself from the embarrassment. And Parker, his ego wounded and his temper rising, looked for a target. His eyes found Grace. In his twisted logic, this was her fault. She was the reason he looked weak. She was the embarrassment sitting alone in her unflattering dress, making him seem like the kind of man who could not control his own household. He stormed toward table 12, snatching a glass of champagne from a passing waiter without breaking stride. Grace watched him approach, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw the rage in his eyes, the set of his jaw, the way his hand tightened around the champagne flute. Parker, please, she whispered as he loomed over her. Everyone is watching. Let them watch, he spat, his voice rising with each word. I just got humiliated by Marcus Sullivan, and I look over here and see you slouching like some kind of diseased cow. You are an embarrassment, Grace. Look at you. You do not belong here. You have never belonged here. I want to go home, she said, tears pricking at her eyes. Please, I am not feeling well. We are not going anywhere until I fix this mess. Parker gestured wildly, Ishwo, with the champagne glass. You are useless to me. You bring nothing to this marriage. No money, no connections, no class. I picked you out of the gutter, and this is how you repay me. By making me look like a fool. Something snapped inside Grace. Maybe it was the pregnancy hormones Parker loved to mock. Maybe it was the accumulated weight of 2 years of abuse finally reaching critical mass. Maybe it was the knowledge that her brothers were somewhere in this room, that help was closer than it had been in years. Whatever the cause, Grace Sullivan stood up. Her legs were shaking. Her voice was trembling. But she stood. I did not make you look like a fool, Parker, she said, her words carrying further than she intended. You did that all by yourself. You are a fraud. You are a bully. And everyone in this room is going to know it. The silence that followed was absolute. Parker stared at her, his mouth hanging open in shock. In 2 years of marriage, she had never spoken back, never challenged him publicly, never given him anything but submission and compliance. Then his shock curdled into fury. You stupid woman, he hissed. You have no idea what you have just done. He raised the champagne glass, and he threw the contents directly into her face. The cold liquid hit her like a slap, soaking her hair, streaming down her cheeks, staining the bodice of her navy blue gown. The gasps from the surrounding crowd were audible. Phones were already appearing, recording the moment for posterity. Parker stood there panting, realizing perhaps that he had gone too far, but too proud to back down. Clean yourself up, he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. You are a mess. This is what I deal with every day. The mood swings, the hysteria. It is exhausting being married to a mentally unstable woman. Grace sat frozen, champagne dripping from her chin, mixing with tears she could no longer control. Then a shadow fell over the table. A shadow that smelled like expensive cologne and contained barely restrained violence. Parker turned around, expecting a waiter. Instead, he found himself chest to chest with Derek Sullivan. Derek was smiling, but it was the kind of smile that made sensible people check for the nearest exit. You seem to be having a rough night, Mr. Mitchell, Derek said pleasantly. Wife troubles? Parker blinked, confused by the attention. He recovered quickly, defaulting to his usual charm. Just a domestic disagreement, nothing serious. You know how women get during pregnancy. Hormonal, emotional, nothing to concern yourself with, Mr. Sullivan. Derek's smile widened. It did not reach his eyes. Is that so? Marcus stepped up beside Derek. Evan flanked the other side. They formed a wall of black wool and barely contained menace. 3 brothers united in purpose for the first time in 3 years. Did you just throw a drink on this woman? Marcus asked calmly. Her? Parker waved a dismissive hand toward Grace, who was still wiping champagne from her eyes. She is my wife. This is a private matter between a husband and wife. I'm sure you understand. Your wife, Derek repeated. Looking at Grace for the first time, he studied her face. The running mascara, the trembling lip, the way she shrank into herself like a child expecting a blow. Hello, Gracie. Parker froze. Grace looked up at her brothers. The brothers she had not spoken to in 3 years. The brothers she had abandoned because she wanted to prove she did not need their money or their protection. The brothers who had come anyway. Hi, Marcus, she whispered. Hi, Derek. Hi, Evan. Parker's head whipped back and forth between them, his brain struggling to process what his ears were telling him. Wait, you know her? That is impossible. She is nobody. She is Grace Smith. She told me she was an orphan. Marcus stepped forward, invading Parker's personal space, until their faces were inches apart. The power dynamic was so completely lopsided that it would have been comical under other circumstances. Her name, Marcus said with ice-cold precision, is Grace Sullivan. She is the primary shareholder of the Kensington Foundation. She built a $40 million company before she turned 30. And she is our sister. Parker's face went the color of old milk. Sullivan? Kensington? But she said, she told me, she wanted to see if anyone could love her without knowing about the money, Evan said quietly, moving past Parker to kneel beside Grace. He pulled a silk handkerchief from his pocket and began gently wiping the champagne from her face. Looks like we got our answer. Evan looked up at Parker, his usually gentle eyes hard as granite. You failed the test, Mitchell. And now you are going to find out what happens when you mess with a Sullivan. Marcus pulled back his fist, and he hit Parker Mitchell with a punch that had 3 years of guilt and fury behind it. Parker dropped to the marble floor like a puppet with cut strings, unconscious before he hits the ground. The ballroom erupted. The presidential suite on the top floor of the Pierre Hotel was quiet. Too quiet after the chaos downstairs. Grace sat on a velvet sofa, wrapped in a warm blanket, sipping herbal tea that tasted like dust in her mouth. A private doctor summoned by Marcus had just finished checking her vital signs and assured everyone that both mother and baby were stable, though stressed and dehydrated. The baby's heartbeat is strong, the doctor said, packing his medical bag, but she needs rest. No more shouting matches, no more emotional upheaval. That child is depending on her to stay calm. Thank you, Dr. Thornton, Marcus said, shaking the man's hand and showing him to the door. We will make sure she is taken care of. When the door clicked shut, the suite suddenly felt enormous. Grace looked at her 3 brothers, these men she had abandoned, and felt the weight of 3 years of silence pressing down on her chest. Marcus stood by the window, staring out at the Manhattan skyline, with his hands clasped behind his back. Even in stillness, he radiated tension. Derek poured himself a scotch. From the minibar, his usual quick wit temporarily silenced. Evan sat on the coffee table directly in front of Grace, close enough to touch her, but holding back, waiting. I am sorry, Grace finally said. Her voice cracked on the words. I am so sorry. I lied to you. I pushed you away. I ran from everything we built together because I wanted to prove. I do not even know what I wanted to prove anymore. Evan reached out and took her hand. His grip was warm and gentle, so different from Parker's. Gracie, you do not have to apologize for wanting a life of your own. We understood. Dad put so much pressure on all of us. The expectations, the obligations, the constant scrutiny. We get why you needed space. It was not just the pressure, Grace admitted, staring down at her tea. I wanted to know that if someone loved me, it was for me, not for the trust fund, not for the connections, not for what I could do for their career. When I met Parker, he did not know anything about our family. He bought me coffee at a volunteer event. He asked about my favorite books. He seemed so normal. Derek set down his scotch glass. Predators always seem normal at first. They mirror what you want to see. They study you like a research project, and then become exactly what you need. That is how they get inside your defenses. Marcus turned from the window, his expression pained. When did it change? When did he start? He could not finish the sentence. After the wedding, Grace whispered, almost immediately, he started criticizing everything. My clothes, my cooking, the way I loaded the dishwasher. Small things at first, then bigger things. He cut off my access to my own bank accounts. He convinced me to invest everything through his financial advisor. He isolated me from my friends. He told me I was lucky he had rescued me from poverty. But you could have called us, Evan said gently. At any point, you could have picked up the phone. Grace shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. You do not understand. He has a recording of me having a mental breakdown. A breakdown he deliberately caused by gaslighting me for months. He had me hospitalized for 3 days. He had me sign documents while I was sedated. I did not know what I was signing, but now he has medical power of attorney. He is my legal guardian. The silence that followed was deafening. What exactly does that mean? Derek asked, slowly, his legal mind already working through the implications. It means he controls everything, Grace said. My money, my medical decisions, my freedom. If I try to leave him, he can have me committed. He can take the baby the moment she is born. He can tell everyone I am mentally unstable, and he has the paperwork to prove it. Marcus's hands curled into fists. That is why you did not call. That is why you stayed. I was trapped. Grace's voice broke completely. I built an app to help women escape situations exactly like this, and I could not escape my own. Do you know how that feels? To be so helpless? To know exactly what is happening to you and be completely unable to stop it? The brothers exchanged glances. A silent communication passed between them, the kind of understanding that comes from growing up together, from facing a difficult father and a complicated family legacy as a united front. Derek Stowe pulled out his phone. I need to see those guardianship documents. If he had you sign them under duress while sedated, there may be grounds to have them invalidated. Marcus nodded. I will have my security team pull his financial records. If he has been misusing Grace's money, that is evidence of fraud. Evan squeezed Grace's hand. And I am going to file for a restraining order first thing in the morning. Whatever legal tricks he thinks he has, we have better lawyers. Grace looked at her brothers, these men who had come running the moment they learned she was in danger, who had crossed an ocean and walked into a party full of strangers to stand beside her. How did you know? She asked. How did you even know I was in trouble? I have been hiding it for so long. Derek smiled grimly. Monica Harper. Grace closed her eyes. Monica, her best friend, the ER nurse who had treated her 3 months ago when she came in with mysterious bruising and would not make eye contact. She has been documenting everything for months, Derek continued. Photos of your injuries, recordings of his voicemails, medical records from your hospital visits. She broke your confidence because she was terrified you were going to end up dead. She called Marcus last week and told him everything. I should be angry at her, Grace said softly. I made her promise not to tell anyone. Marcus crossed the room and sat down beside her, pulling her into the kind of hug she had not received in 3 years. A big brother hug, solid and warm and safe. She saved your life, Marcus said, his voice rough with emotion. We are going to send her flowers, expensive flowers, maybe buy her a house. A sound escaped Grace that was half laugh, half sob. She buried her face in her brother's shoulder and let herself cry for real. Not the careful, controlled tears she permitted herself in the bathroom when Parker was asleep. Real crying, ugly crying, the kind that shakes your whole body and leaves you feeling wrung out, but somehow lighter. For the first time in 2 years, Grace Sullivan felt something that might have been hope. Then a loud banging on the suite door shattered the moment. Grace, I know you are in there. Parker's voice was muffled but unmistakable, hysterical, desperate. Open this door right now. That is my wife. You cannot kidnap her. I will call the police. I will sue every single one of you. Marcus's face hardened into stone. He looked at Derek, a question in his eyes. Derek nodded slowly. Let him in. We need to finish this conversation. Marcus walked to the door and threw it open. Parker Mitchell stumbled into the suite, looking like a completely different man than the one who had strutted into the gala hours earlier. His tie was missing. His shirt was unbuttoned. His jaw was already swelling from Marcus's punch, and his eyes had the wild, unfocused look of someone whose entire world had just collapsed. He stopped when he saw the brothers arrayed around Grace like a protective wall. For a moment, something like fear flickered across his features. Then he straightened, attempting to reassemble his shattered dignity. "Grace," he said, ignoring the men. "Baby, please come home. You're confused. These men are intimidating you. Whatever they told you, it is lies. I am your husband. I love you. We can work this out." Grace looked at him, really looked at him. For the first time in 2 years, the fog of fear and manipulation lifted, and she saw him clearly. A small man, a greedy man, a man who was terrified of losing his meal ticket now that he knew what it was actually worth. "You do not love me, Parker," she said. Her voice was steady now, calm. "You love owning me. You love controlling me. And you love the idea of my money now that you know it exists." "That is not true." Parker's voice cracked. He took a step toward her, hands outstretched. "Think about the baby. Our child needs a father. Families stay together. That is what families do." Marcus stepped between them, a solid wall of muscle and menace. "One more step," Marcus said quietly, "and you will not have legs to walk on. The baby is a Sullivan. You are a Mitchell. And as of tonight, those two names will never appear in the same sentence again." Parker's desperation curdled into something uglier. His eyes narrowed, his lips twisted into a sneer. "You think you have won?" he hissed. "You think this is over? We have a prenuptial agreement, Grace. If you leave me, you get nothing. Nothing. I made sure of it. My lawyer wrote that contract specifically to protect me from gold-digging wives who get ideas above their station." Derek actually laughed. He walked to a briefcase sitting on the desk and pulled out a thick file. "Ah, yes," Derek said. "The prenup. We read that too. Very interesting document. Tell me, Parker, did you actually hire a lawyer, or did you download a template from the internet to save money?" Parker shifted uncomfortably. "It is legally binding." "It is," Derek agreed. "But you did not read the clause about separately acquired property. It states that any assets brought into the marriage remain the sole property of the original owner. Since Grace's trust fund and company shares existed before you ever met her, you have no claim to them. However, the clause about infidelity is very clear. If either party cheats, the marriage is voided and the cheating party forfeits all marital assets." Derek tossed a stack of photographs onto the coffee table. They were high-resolution images. Parker and Tiffany Lawson entering a hotel. Parker and Tiffany at a restaurant, holding hands. Parker and Tiffany in the window of his office, very late at night, very clearly not working. "We have been watching you for a week," Evans said. "We have 4K video of you committing adultery. You get nothing. No alimony, no asset division. You leave this marriage with exactly what you brought into it. Nothing." Parker stared at the photographs. His face cycled through shock, fear, and finally a desperate, cornered rage. "I will fight for custody," he snarled. "I will take the baby. I will drag you through courts for years. I will make your life a living hell." Grace stood up. She walked past Marcus, past Derek, past Evan. She walked right up to Parker and looked him directly in the eyes. "You do not want this baby," she said quietly. "You called our child a burden this morning. You told me I was diseased. You said having a pregnant wife was ruining your social life." Parker's mouth opened, but no words came out. "If you try to fight for custody," Grace continued, "I will release the recordings from the security cameras in the penthouse." Parker froze. What security cameras? The ones I installed inside the smoke detectors 3 months ago. Grace was lying. It was a bluff, delivered with every ounce of confidence her brothers had taught her. Every time you screamed at me, every time you threw something, every time you called me worthless, it is all recorded. Do you really want that played in court? Do you want it played on the evening news? It was the final nail in the coffin. Parker knew what he was. He knew what he sounded like behind closed doors. He knew that his entire public image, the feminist ally, the philanthropist, the ethical businessman, would crumble the moment anyone heard how he actually treated his wife. He slumped, defeated. "Get out," Grace whispered. "Get out and do not ever contact me again." Marcus stepped forward, placing a hand on Parker's chest and shoving him backward toward the door. "You heard her. If I see you near my sister again, I will not use lawyers. I will use my hands." Parker stumbled into the hallway. The heavy door slammed shut in his face, locking him out of the luxury, the money, and the life he had so foolishly destroyed. Grace stood in the center of the suite, shaking with adrenaline and disbelief. For a moment, she thought it was over. She thought she had won. She had no idea that the real battle was just beginning. The next morning dawned gray and cold over Manhattan. Grace woke in the guest bedroom of the Sullivan family's penthouse, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar ceiling and the softness of sheets that did not smell like Parker's cologne. Then the memories came flooding back. The gala, the champagne, her brothers, the confrontation. Freedom? She sat up slowly, her hand automatically moving to her pregnant belly. The baby kicked in response, a strong, healthy movement that made Grace smile, despite everything. "We are going to be okay," she whispered. "I promise you. We are going to be okay." A knock at the door preceded Monica Harper's entrance. Her best friend looked like she had not slept, dark circles under her eyes, but she was carrying a tray with herbal tea and toast. "How are you feeling?" Monica asked, setting the tray on the bedside table. "The doctor said you should take it easy for at least a week." Grace looked at her friend, the woman who had betrayed her confidence and probably saved her life. "Thank you," Grace said, "for calling them. I was too proud and too scared to do it myself." Monica sat on the edge of the bed. "I watched my aunt stay with an abusive husband until he put her in a coma. She never woke up. I was not going to watch that happen to you." They sat in silence for a moment, two women who understood things about violence and survival that should not have to be understood. "Derek wants to see you in the main room," Monica finally said. "He has been on the phone with lawyers all night, something about the guardianship documents." Grace's stomach twisted with anxiety. The documents. The trap Parker had sprung while she was too drugged to understand what she was signing. The legal cage that was supposed to keep her imprisoned forever. She dressed quickly and made her way to the penthouse's main living area. Her brothers were already there. Marcus stood by the window, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in low, urgent tones. Evan had papers spread across the dining table, making notes in the margins. Derek was pacing, his expression troubled in a way that made Grace's heart sink. "What is it?" she asked. "What is wrong?" Derek stopped pacing. He turned to face her, and the look in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. "The guardianship documents are legitimate," Derek said flatly. "Parker's lawyer, his name is William Crawford. He is one of the best estate attorneys in the city. The paperwork was filed correctly. The signatures were witnessed. From a legal standpoint, Parker Mitchell is your medical guardian." Grace felt the floor shift beneath her feet. "But I was sedated. I did not know what I was signing." "I know," Derek said, "and we can argue that in court. But it will take months, maybe years. These cases are complicated. The burden of proof is on us to demonstrate that you were mentally incompetent at the time of signing, and that Parker deliberately exploited that incompetence. What about the abuse? Grace asked desperately. What about Monica's documentation? The photos? The recordings? Derek sighed. Helpful for the divorce proceedings and the criminal case. Not directly relevant to the guardianship issue. Those are separate legal matters handled by different courts. Marcus ended his call and turned from the window. There is more, he said grimly. I just spoke to our contact at the district attorney's office. Parker is claiming that you assaulted him last night. He has witnesses who saw you throw a drink at him. What it? Grace stared at her brother in disbelief. He threw the drink at me. Everyone saw it. He has a socialite named Dorothy Pemberton willing to testify that she saw you throw the drink first and that Parker was simply defending himself. Marcus's jaw tightened. Money can buy a lot of things, including memories. Grace sank onto the nearest sofa, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. This could not be happening. After everything, after the confrontation, after standing up for herself, she was still trapped. There is something else, Evan said quietly. He looked up from his papers, his expression pained. I reviewed the trust documents Derek set up to manage your company's sale proceeds. Parker's financial advisor, the one you transferred everything to. His name is Raymond Cole. He is not actually a licensed financial advisor. He is a private investigator. A private investigator? Grace repeated. I do not understand. Parker hired him 2 years before you met. Evan slid a document across the table. This is an invoice for surveillance services. Your name is on it. Parker was watching you, Grace. He knew exactly who you were and what you were worth before he ever introduced himself at that literacy event. The room spun. The chance meeting that was not chance. The patience that was not patience. The love that was never love. It was all a con. From the very beginning, Grace had been the mark in an elaborate scheme to steal her fortune. He researched me, Grace whispered. He targeted me. The whole relationship was a lie. Marcus crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt before his sister, taking her hands in his. Grace, look at me. We are going to fix this. We have more resources than he does. We have better lawyers than he does. This is going to take time, but we will untangle every thread of this trap he built around you. Time, Grace repeated. She laughed bitterly. I do not have time, Marcus. This baby is due in 4 weeks. Under the guardianship, Parker can be present at the delivery. He can make medical decisions about my care. He can take the baby home with him if he convinces a judge that I am unfit. Then we accelerate everything, Derek said. He pulled out his phone. I am calling an emergency meeting with every lawyer on our payroll. We file motions tomorrow morning. We get a sympathetic judge assigned. We bury Parker in so much paperwork that he cannot see straight. And if that does not work? Grace asked. The brothers exchanged glances. Then we explore other options, Marcus said. His tone suggested those options existed in a gray area of the law. No, Grace shook her head. I appreciate what you are willing to do for me, but I will not become the kind of person who breaks the law to get what she wants. I built my app because I believed in the system. I believed that if women had the right information and the right support, the system would protect them. The system failed you, Monica said quietly from the doorway. Then I need to fix the system. Grace met her friend's eyes, not go around it. The moment hung in the air, heavy with frustration and helplessness. Then Derek's phone rang. He answered, listened, and his face went pale. That was building security, he said. Parker's lawyer is downstairs. He has a court order. He wants to see Grace, alone. The room exploded into motion. Marcus moved toward the door. Evan started gathering documents. Monica positioned herself next to Grace, like a bodyguard. He cannot just demand access, Evan protested. We have not even filed for divorce yet. The court order is not about the divorce, Derek said. His voice was hollow. It is about the baby. Parker filed for emergency custody this morning. He is claiming Grace is suicidal and poses an immediate threat to the unborn child. The judge signed off an hour ago. Grace felt the blood drain from her face. Emergency custody. Before the baby was even born. Parker was not just fighting to keep his prize. He was fighting to take her child. "Let the lawyer up," Grace said. The brothers turned to stare at her. "Are you insane?" Marcus demanded. "You are not meeting with that snake without representation." Grace stood up, drawing on reserves of strength she did not know she possessed. "If I refuse to see him, it looks like I have something to hide. It looks like I am the unstable, paranoid woman Parker has been painting me as. Let him come up. Let him say whatever he has to say, and let him underestimate me one more time." Marcus studied his sister for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "All right, but we are staying in the next room. The moment you need us, we will be there." Grace smoothed her hair and straightened her spine. She had spent 2 years learning to survive Parker Mitchell. Now she was going to learn how to defeat him. William Crawford was exactly what Grace expected. A man in his 60s, with silver hair, expensive cufflinks, and the cold eyes of someone who had spent decades destroying families for billable hours. He sat across from her in the living room, a leather briefcase open on the coffee table between them, papers fanned out like an accusation. "Mrs. Mitchell," Crawford began smoothly, "I appreciate you agreeing to see me. My client is deeply concerned about your well-being and the well-being of your unborn child. Your client threw champagne in my face at a public event last night," Grace replied. "His concern is noted." Crawford smiled thinly. "My client was provoked. Multiple witnesses observed you becoming hysterical and making wild accusations. In his distress, he reacted poorly. He deeply regrets the incident and has already checked himself into an anger management program to address his behavior." Grace almost laughed. Parker Mitchell, voluntarily attending therapy, the man who believed psychologists were charlatans and emotions were for the weak. "How convenient," she said. "The point, Mrs. Mitchell," Crawford continued, "is that my client wants to resolve this matter quietly and amicably. He has no desire to drag your name through the court. He understands that you have been under tremendous stress, and he believes that with proper treatment, you can recover your mental stability." "My mental stability," Grace repeated. "Is that what we are calling it?" Crawford's smile did not waver. "You have a documented history of psychiatric hospitalization. You have exhibited erratic behavior in public settings. You made unfounded accusations against a respected businessman and philanthropist. The court has reviewed the evidence and determined that you pose a potential threat to your unborn child. This is not personal, Mrs. Mitchell. This is simply the law." Grace leaned forward. "Let me tell you what I see, Mr. Crawford. I see a man who targeted a wealthy woman, isolated her from her family, systematically destroyed her self-esteem, and then used the mental health crisis he deliberately caused to seize legal control of her assets. I see embezzlement, fraud, and domestic abuse hiding behind expensive lawyers and charitable donations. I see a house of cards that is going to collapse the moment someone looks at it closely." Crawford's smile finally faded. "That is a very serious accusation. It is a very serious situation." For a long moment, they stared at each other across the coffee table. Then Crawford reached into his briefcase and withdrew a photograph. "Do you recognize this woman?" he asked. Grace looked at the image. It showed a blonde woman, approximately 40 years old, walking down a city street. She looked tired, defeated. There were dark circles under her eyes. "No," Grace said. "I do not know who that is. Her name is Virginia Hartley." Crawford's voice was casual, but his eyes were watchful. "She is Parker's mother. Everyone thinks she died 12 years ago. Car accident. Very tragic. But as you can see from this photograph, taken 3 days ago, in Boca Raton, Florida. She is very much alive. Grace's brow furrowed. I do not understand. What does Parker's mother have to do with this? Crawford tucked the photograph back into his briefcase. Virginia Hartley was diagnosed with severe bipolar disorder in her 30s. Her husband, Richard Hartley, had her committed to a psychiatric facility for her own protection. When she was eventually released, she chose to disappear rather than return to her family. She changed her name, cut all ties, let everyone believe she had died. He leaned forward, his eyes boring into Grace's. The point, Mrs. Mitchell, is that mental illness runs in families. Your child will share genetics with a woman who spent years in an institution. Parker is simply taking precautions to ensure that if you exhibit similar symptoms, there is a legal framework in place to protect the baby. Grace felt the blood drain from her face. This was the threat beneath the surface. This was the trap within the trap. They were going to use Parker's mother's history to argue that Grace's child might inherit mental instability. They were going to construct a narrative where Parker was the responsible parent and Grace was the dangerous unknown. I think we are done here, Grace said coldly. Crawford gathered his papers with methodical precision. My client is prepared to offer you a settlement, full custody to Parker, but you would have supervised visitation rights. He would cover all your medical expenses. He would even agree to a modest monthly allowance to help you get back on your feet. Get out. Think about it, Mrs. Mitchell. Crawford stood, buttoning his jacket. The alternative is a prolonged court battle that will drain your resources, expose your family's secrets, and likely end with the same result. Parker has the law on his side. He has the documentation. He has witnesses willing to testify to your instability. What do you have? Grace stood up, matching his height in her heels. I have something Parker has never understood, she said. I have people who love me, people who will fight for me. Not because of what I am worth, but because of who I am. Crawford's lip curled with something like pity. Love does not win court cases, Mrs. Mitchell. Evidence wins court cases. And right now, all the evidence points to you being exactly what my client says you are. A troubled woman in need of help. He walked to the door, then paused. You have 72 hours to respond to the custody petition. After that, we proceed to an emergency hearing. I suggest you spend that time very carefully. The door closed behind him. Grace stood alone in the center of the room, shaking with a combination of rage and terror. Her brothers emerged from the adjacent study, where they had been listening to every word. That was illuminating, Derek said grimly. They have more than I thought. Parker's mother is alive, Evan said. That is significant. If we can find her, get her to testify about what Richard Hartley did to her. It does not matter, Grace interrupted. Her voice was hollow. You heard what Crawford said. They have the law on their side. They have the documentation. They have everything they need to take my daughter from me. Marcus put his hand on her shoulder. Gracie, we are not going to let that happen. Grace looked at her brother, this man who had protected her since childhood, who had crossed an ocean the moment he learned she was in danger. I know you want to help, she said, but I am done being rescued. I am done being the damsel in distress. This is my fight, Marcus, and I need to fight it my way. What are you thinking? Derek asked. Grace walked to the window and looked out at the city below. Manhattan, the island of dreams and nightmares, where fortunes were made and lost every day. Crawford thinks I am weak, she said slowly. Parker thinks I am stupid. Everyone thinks I am just a scared pregnant woman with no resources and no options. She turned to face her brothers. They have forgotten who I am. They have forgotten what I built. I created an app that helped 200,000 women escape situations exactly like mine. I raised $30 million. I stood in front of investors and regulators and critics and made them believe in something that had never existed before. Her jaw set with determination. Parker trapped me with information and legal documents. Fine. I will beat him with the same weapons. I will find every lie he has ever told. I will document every crime he has ever committed. And I will build a case so airtight that no judge in the world would give him custody of a goldfish, let alone my daughter. Derek smiled slowly. Now that sounds like the Grace Sullivan I remember. I need access to his cloud backups, Grace said, her mind already racing. His email, his financial records, his communications with Raymond Cole. That would be illegal, Evan pointed out. Only if I get caught, Grace replied. Besides, technically, we are still married. Accessing shared marital assets is not a crime. That is a creative interpretation of property law, Evan said. I like it. Monica stepped forward. I have a friend in IT security. She owes me a favor. She might be able to help with the technical aspects. Grace nodded. Good. We have 72 hours. Let us use every single one of them. For the first time since the gala, she felt something other than fear. She felt like herself again. 48 hours later, Grace found herself doing something she never thought she would do. She was breaking into her husband's office. It was 2 a.m. The Mitchell Logistics building was theoretically empty, but Parker's head of security, Frank Reynolds, was known to do random sweeps throughout the night. They had a window of approximately 30 minutes. This is insane, Monica whispered beside her. You are 8 months pregnant. You should be in bed eating ice cream and watching Netflix. I will eat ice cream when my daughter is safe, Grace replied. She punched a code into the back entrance keypad. The code Parker did not know she knew, memorized from watching him enter it a dozen times. The door clicked open. They moved through the darkened building in silence. Derek had provided them with the location of Parker's private server. Evan had arranged for a distraction to keep Frank Reynolds occupied on the other side of the building. Marcus was waiting in a car around the corner, ready to extract them at a moment's notice. It was a family operation. The Sullivan siblings working together for the first time in years. The office was on the 7th floor. Grace used her key card, praying that Parker had not yet revoked her access. The light flashed green. The door opened. Parker's corner office was exactly as she remembered it. Expensive furniture, framed photographs of him shaking hands with politicians and celebrities. A view of Manhattan that cost more per square foot than most apartments. And in the corner, humming quietly, the server that held all his secrets. Monica moved to the computer while Grace kept watch by the door. Her friend's fingers flew across the keyboard, executing the programs their IT contact had provided. I am in, Monica said. Oh my God, Grace, you need to see this. Grace crossed the room and looked at the screen. Files. Hundreds of files. Emails between Parker and Raymond Cole dating back 4 years. Financial records showing money moving through offshore accounts. Photographs of Grace taken without her knowledge. Surveillance shots from long before they had ever met. He was stalking me, Grace whispered. For years before we started dating. It gets worse, Monica scrolled down. Look at these emails. He was communicating with someone about your trust fund structure. Someone who had insider knowledge of how your money was set up. Grace leaned closer, reading the email chain. The sender was not identified by name, only by an anonymous email address. But the level of detail was staggering. This person knew about the Kensington Foundation. They knew about Grace's role in her brother's investments. They knew exactly how much she was worth and exactly how to access it. Who would have this information? Monica asked. Grace's blood ran cold. Only family. Only someone who had been inside the Sullivan inner circle. We need to copy everything, Grace said. We can analyze it later. Right now, we just need to get out. Monica inserted a flash drive and began the transfer. That was when the lights came on. Grace spun around. Parker stood in the doorway, still wearing his evening clothes, his face twisted with triumph. "Did you really think I would not know the moment you used that keycard?" he asked. "I have alerts set up on everything, Grace. I have been watching you stumble around my building for the last 20 minutes. Parker." Grace's heart hammered against her ribs. "This is not what it looks like. It is exactly what it looks like." Parker stepped into the office, pulling out his phone. "It looks like my mentally unstable wife broke into my office in the middle of the night to steal company property. It looks like evidence of criminal behavior. It looks like every judge in New York giving me exactly what I asked for." Grace felt the walls closing in. The trap. Another trap. She had walked right into it. "You are going to lose everything," Parker continued, dialing a number. "Your money, your freedom, your child. I told you what would happen if you defied me. You should have listened." Behind Grace, the server continued to hum. The file transfer was still in progress. 80% complete. "Parker," Grace said, her voice shaking. "Please, we can talk about this. We can work something out." Parker laughed. The sound was ugly, cruel, familiar. "Talk? You want to talk now? After you humiliated me at the gala? After you turned my own lawyers against me? After you let your brothers treat me like trash?" He stepped closer, backing her against the desk. "You are nothing, Grace. You have always been nothing. A pretty face with a fat bank account. I should have taken the money and left years ago, but I wanted the satisfaction of watching you break. And now, I have it. 90% complete." Grace needed a stall. Just a few more seconds. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you do this? You could have married anyone. Why target me?" Parker's smile turned cold. "Because you deserved it," he said. "Walking around with all that money, pretending to be ordinary, volunteering at literacy programs, like some kind of saint while people like me scraped for every dollar. You wanted to be loved for yourself? You wanted someone to see past the billions? I saw past them, Grace. I saw the scared little girl who was desperate for validation. And I gave her exactly what she wanted. 100%. The flash drive beeped quietly. Monica pulled it from the computer, her hand shaking. Parker heard the sound. His head whipped around. "What was that?" he demanded. And at that exact moment, Grace felt a sensation she had been dreading for weeks. A gush of warm liquid. A tightening across her abdomen that stole her breath. Her water had broken. "Grace?" Monica's voice was sharp with alarm. "Grace, what is happening?" Grace looked down at the puddle forming beneath her feet. Then she looked at Parker, whose face was cycling through confusion, realization, and a terrible kind of anticipation. "Call an ambulance," Grace gasped as a contraction seized her body. "The baby is coming." Parker's phone was still in his hand. He looked at it, then at her, and his smile returned. "Oh, I will call someone," he said, "but it will not be an ambulance. It will be my lawyer. And then the police come. And by the time this night is over, I will have everything I ever wanted, including my daughter." The pain was blinding. Grace grabbed the edge of the desk, struggling to stay upright. "You cannot do this," she managed. "I am in labor. You cannot just let me suffer." "Watch me," Parker said. And then, from the doorway behind him, a voice. "Actually," someone said calmly, "we are going to watch you." Parker spun around. Marcus Sullivan stood in the doorway. Derek was behind him, and Evan, and Frank Reynolds, the head of security, who appeared to have switched sides. "Your employees are very loyal when they are paid enough," Derek said pleasantly. "Also when they learn their boss has been embezzling from the company pension fund." Parker's face went white. "You cannot be here. This is private property." "Funny thing about private property," Marcus said, stepping forward. "It is only private if you own it. As of 3 hours ago, Kensington Foundation owns a controlling interest in Mitchell Logistics. We bought your debt. We bought your investors. We bought your building, which means right now you are the one trespassing. Grace felt another contraction rip through her body. She cried out, gripping Monica's arm. We need to get her to a hospital, Monica said urgently. She is in active labor. Marcus nodded at Evan. Get her downstairs. Derek has a car waiting. Evan crossed the room and gently took Grace's arm, supporting her weight. You are going to be okay, he murmured. We have got you. As they moved toward the door, Parker made one last desperate lunge. That is my child, he screamed. You cannot take my child. Marcus caught him by the collar and slammed him against the wall. Your child, Marcus repeated. Let me tell you what is going to happen, Mitchell. You are going to be arrested for embezzlement, fraud, and stalking. You are going to spend the next 15 to 20 years in federal prison. And when you get out, your daughter will be a grown woman who has never heard your name. He released Parker's collar, letting him slide down the wall to the floor. That is what happens, Marcus said, when you mess with a Sullivan. Grace did not hear Parker's response. Another contraction was building, a tidal wave of pain that obliterated everything else. She focused on breathing, on moving, on surviving. The elevator, the lobby, the cold night air, and then the hospital, where everything would either come together or fall apart. Mount Sinai Hospital, 3:15 in the morning. Grace lay in the delivery suite, monitors beeping steadily around her, gripping Monica's hand hard enough to leave bruises. The labor was progressing quickly. Too quickly, according to Dr. Elizabeth Thornton, who had been woken from a sound sleep and summoned by Marcus Sullivan's personal assistant with the promise of a generous donation to the hospital's pediatric wing. The baby is in position, Dr. Thornton said, checking the monitors. You are already 8 centimeters dilated. This little one is eager to meet the world. Grace groaned through another contraction. Is that good or bad? It is fast, the doctor replied diplomatically. Your brothers are in the waiting room? Do you want me to let them in? No. Grace shook her head. Not yet. I need to focus. Monica wiped her forehead with a cool cloth. You are doing amazing, Gracie. Just breathe. Grace tried to focus on breathing, but her mind kept spinning back to the office. The files on the flash drive. Parker's words. The trap that had almost closed around her. The files, she gasped between contractions. Monica, do you still have the flash drive? Monica patted her pocket. Safe and sound. Give it to Derek. He needs to start analyzing everything immediately. There is someone else involved. Someone who fed Parker information about my family. Grace, Monica said gently, you are about to have a baby. The files can wait. They cannot wait. Grace grabbed her friend's arm. Parker said the guardianship documents give him decision-making power over the baby. If his lawyer arrives with another court order, if he convinces a judge that I am unfit. He is not going to do anything, Monica assured her. Marcus has people outside. Derek is already working with the lawyers. You are safe. Grace wanted to believe her. She wanted to sink into the relief of being surrounded by people who loved her, of being protected instead of hunted. But she had learned too well that safety was an illusion. Another contraction hit, stronger than the others. Grace cried out, her body arching against the pain. 10 centimeters, Dr. Thornton announced. It is time to push. The next 20 minutes were a blur of agony and determination. Grace pushed when they told her to push, breathed when they told her to breathe, held onto Monica's hand like a lifeline. And at 3:57 in the morning, she heard the most beautiful sound in the world, a baby's cry. It is a girl, Dr. Thornton announced, lifting the tiny, squirming bundle into the light. Congratulations, Grace. She is perfect. The nurses cleaned the baby quickly and placed her on Grace's chest. She was small and warm and impossibly alive, her eyes blinking against the fluorescent lights, her tiny fingers curling and uncurling. Grace looked down at her daughter and felt everything else fall away. "Hi, baby," she whispered. "I am your mom. I have been waiting so long to meet you." The baby made a small sound, something between a sigh and a coo, and nestled closer to Grace's heart. For a long moment, there was only this: mother and child, the end of one journey and the beginning of another. Then the door burst open. Parker Mitchell stormed into the delivery suite, two security guards trailing behind him, waving a piece of paper. "Emergency custody order," he shouted. "Signed by Judge Harold Brennan. That child is coming with me." Grace clutched her daughter tighter. "No. You are not taking her. I have a court order," Parker spat. He thrust the paper toward Dr. Thornton. "Read it yourself. I have legal authority." Dr. Thornton examined the document, her face troubled. "I need to verify this with hospital administration. Verify it all you want." Parker's eyes were wild, desperate. "That is my daughter. I have rights." The security guards moved toward the bed. Grace felt her world narrowing to a single point. Her daughter, her baby, the child she had carried for 9 months, had protected, had loved before she ever saw her face. "Please," Grace begged. "Please do not do this." Parker smiled. It was the cruelest smile she had ever seen. "I warned you what would happen," he said. "You should have listened." The security guard reached for the baby, and then Marcus Sullivan walked through the door. He did not run, he did not shout. He simply walked, unhurried and unstoppable, until he was standing between the guard and the bed. "That is close enough," Marcus said quietly. The guard hesitated. He looked at Parker. He looked at Marcus. He wisely chose not to move. "This is none of your business," Parker snarled. "I have a court order." "I am aware of your court order," Marcus replied. "I am also aware that Judge Harold Brennan accepted a $50,000 payment from your father 6 months ago to ensure favorable rulings in exactly this kind of situation. That information is currently being reviewed by the Judicial Ethics Committee. I expect Judge Brennan will be disbarred by the end of the week." Parker's face went pale. "That is a lie." "I do not lie," Marcus said. "I just have better information than you do." Derek appeared in the doorway, phone in hand. "Just got off the call with the actual duty judge," he announced. "She has reviewed the situation and issued a temporary restraining order against Parker Mitchell, effective immediately. He is not allowed within 500 feet of Grace or the baby." "This is outrageous," Parker screamed. "You cannot do this." "I have rights. You have the right to remain silent," Derek said pleasantly. "I suggest you use it." 2 police officers appeared behind Derek. "Parker Mitchell," one of them said, "you are under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and violation of a restraining order." The color drained from Parker's face. "You will pay for this," he hissed at Grace. "All of you will pay." "Probably not," Derek replied as the officers handcuffed Parker and led him away. "We have really good lawyers." The door closed. The room was quiet. Grace looked down at her daughter, who had slept through the entire confrontation, undisturbed by the chaos that had swirled around her. "It is over," Monica said softly. "Grace, it is over." But Grace knew better. She had seen the look in Parker's eyes, the desperation, the hatred. This was not over. This was just the beginning. She held her daughter closer and made a silent promise. "Whatever it takes, however long it takes, I will keep you safe." She just had no idea how hard that promise would be to keep 6 months later. The trial of Parker Mitchell was the biggest story in New York. Every newspaper, every news channel, every social media platform was saturated with coverage. The fall of the Golden Boy, the feminist ally revealed as a predator, the woman who had built an empire to help abuse survivors, becoming a survivor herself. Grace sat in the front row of the courtroom. Her daughter Hope sleeping peacefully in Monica's arms behind her. She wore a white suit that she had chosen deliberately, a statement of purity and resolve against the darkness she was about to confront. Parker sat at the defense table, looking nothing like the man she had married. Prison had aged him terribly. His expensive suit hung loosely on a frame that had lost weight from stress. His hair was graying at the temples. His eyes, once so confident, now darted nervously around the room. William Crawford sat beside him, looking considerably less smug than he had during their last encounter. The prosecution had been devastating. Evan had coordinated with the district attorney's office to present a case that was meticulous, comprehensive, and utterly damning. Financial records showing years of embezzlement, email chains proving premeditated targeting of Grace, testimony from former employees, former girlfriends, former associates who had all experienced Parker's manipulation. Tiffany Lawson had been the surprise witness. The woman Grace had once considered a rival had taken the stand and revealed that she, too, had been a victim. Parker had promised her everything and given her nothing. He had used her just as he had used Grace. The jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Patricia Coleman asked. The foreman stood. "We have, Your Honor. We find the defendant, Parker Mitchell, guilty on all counts." The courtroom erupted. Grace closed her eyes, letting the wave of vindication wash over her. It was done. After 2 years of abuse and 6 months of legal warfare, it was finally done. Parker was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. As he passed Grace's row, he stopped and looked at her. "This is not over," he said quietly. "My father will not let this stand." Grace met his eyes. "Your father is next." The second trial began 3 weeks later. Richard Hartley, Parker's father, was charged with conspiracy, fraud, and unlawful imprisonment. The evidence against him had come from an unexpected source: Virginia Hartley, Parker's mother, the woman everyone thought was dead. Derek's investigators had tracked her down in Florida, living under an assumed name, still afraid of the man who had destroyed her life 40 years ago. When she learned that Richard was about to do the same thing to her grandchild, something inside her snapped. She agreed to testify. "He told everyone I was crazy," Virginia said from the witness stand, her voice trembling but determined. "He had me committed to a psychiatric facility for 3 years. 3 years, in a place where they drugged me so heavily I could barely remember my own name. When I finally got out, I ran. I changed everything about myself. I let my own children believe I was dead because I thought it was the only way to escape." Richard Hartley sat at the defense table, his face a mask of cold contempt. He was a man who had spent his entire life controlling others, a man who believed that money and power made him untouchable. He was about to learn otherwise. "The documents show that you have used the same tactics on 3 subsequent wives," the prosecutor continued. "Each one was declared mentally incompetent. Each one had their assets transferred to your control. Each one eventually disappeared." "They left voluntarily," Richard said smoothly. "Women are emotionally unstable by nature. I was simply protecting them from themselves." Grace watched from the gallery, her hands clenched in her lap. This was the man behind the man, the architect of Parker's cruelty, the source code of a family system designed to exploit and destroy women. Virginia met her eyes across the courtroom. In that moment, Grace saw something she recognized: the exhaustion of a survivor, the determination of someone who has nothing left to lose. "I have one more question," the prosecutor said. "Did you ever tell your son that this behavior was wrong?" Virginia's laugh was bitter. "Wrong. I told him it was how our family operated. I told him women were investments, not people. I taught him everything his father taught me. And by the time I realized what I had created, It was too late. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Richard Hartley was convicted on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 20 years, citing the calculated nature of his crimes and the devastating impact on his victims. As he was led from the courtroom, Richard turned and looked at Grace. "You think you have won," he said, "but there are more like me, more like my son. You cannot stop all of them." Grace stood up. "You are right," she said. "I cannot stop all of them, but I can make it harder for them to hide." She walked out of this courtroom and into the sunlight, where her brothers were waiting with hope. The baby reached for her mother, gurgling happily. Grace took her daughter in her arms and held her close. "It is over," Marcus said, "for real this time." "No," Grace replied. She looked at her brothers, at Monica, at the crowd of reporters waiting behind the police barriers. "It is not over. It is just beginning." "What do you mean?" Derek asked. Grace smiled. "Parker used the system against me. Richard used it against his wives. How many other women are trapped in the same way? How many are being told they are crazy, having their children taken, losing everything because they trusted the wrong person?" She adjusted hope in her arms. "I built one app to help women escape," she said. "Now I am going to build something bigger. A foundation, a network, a way to expose men like Parker and Richard before they can do this to anyone else." Evan nodded slowly. "A legal defense fund for abuse survivors. And a database of predator tactics," Derek added, "so women can recognize the warning signs. And security resources," Marcus contributed, "so they can get out safely when they need to." Grace looked at her brothers, her partners, her family. "The Sullivan Foundation," she said. "That is what we will call it, and we will change everything." 1 year later, the Sullivan Foundation occupied the top 3 floors of a building in Midtown Manhattan. Its walls were lined with photographs of the women it had helped. Over 2,000 in the first 12 months. Women who had been trapped in situations that seemed impossible until someone showed them a way out. Grace stood at the window of her office, watching the city sprawl beneath her. Hope was toddling around the room, chasing a ball that Derek kept rolling just out of her reach. "Faster," Derek encouraged. "You are almost walking like a real person. A few more weeks, and you will be running marathons." Hope giggled and lunged for the ball, missing spectacularly and landing on her diaper-padded bottom. "Close enough," Derek said. "I am counting that as a victory." Grace smiled at the scene. Her brother, the hedge fund manager, who regularly moved billions of dollars, reduced to a puddle of adoration by a 1-year-old with her mother's eyes. The past year had been the hardest of her life, but also the most meaningful. The foundation had exceeded every expectation. The Legal Defense Fund had helped hundreds of women challenge abusive guardianship arrangements. The security network had facilitated dozens of safe extractions. The database of predator tactics had been accessed over 500,000 times, helping women recognize warning signs before it was too late. And Grace had found something she had been missing for years: purpose. Not the purpose of building wealth or proving herself to others. Real purpose, the kind that comes from using your pain to prevent someone else's suffering. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. Monica entered, holding an envelope. "This just arrived. Certified mail. No return address." Grace frowned. She had received hundreds of pieces of mail since the trials. Most were letters of support. Some were threats from people who believed Parker and Richard had been unfairly persecuted. She had learned to open all of them carefully. She slit the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "Dear Grace," she read aloud, "thank you for what you did. I have been hiding for 7 years. He told everyone I died in a car accident, but I did not die. I ran, and now that he is in prison, I can finally come home. There is something you need to know about your daughter, something I discovered before I disappeared. something that changes everything. My name is Rebecca Ashford. I was Parker's first wife, the wife nobody knew existed. Please call me. We need to talk. Grace stared at the letter, her heart pounding. Parker's first wife, a woman who had been declared dead 7 years ago, a woman who had information about hope. What does it say? Derek asked, rising from the floor with hope in his arms. Grace looked at her daughter, at the child she had fought so hard to protect, at the center of her universe. I do not know yet, she said slowly, but I think the story is not over. She walked to the window and looked out at the city again, the same city where she had been trapped, the same city where she had been saved, the same city where she was now helping others find their way out of darkness. Whatever Rebecca Ashford had to tell her, Grace would face it. She had learned that much over the past year. The only way out is through. The only path to peace is through truth. She picked up her phone and dialed the number at the bottom of the letter. It rang twice. Hello? A woman's voice. Tentative, frightened, hopeful. This is Grace Sullivan, Grace said. I got your letter. Tell me everything. And in a quiet office in Manhattan, with her daughter playing at her feet and her family surrounding her, Grace began the next chapter of her story. Because some battles are worth fighting, some truths are worth knowing, and some women refuse to stay silent. Drop a comment below and tell me, what would you have done in Grace's situation? Would you have revealed your identity at the gala? Or would you have waited for an even bigger moment? I read every single comment, and the best ones get pinned. If this story moved you, smash that like button. It takes 1 second, but it tells the algorithm to show this video to someone who might really need to hear it today. Share this with a friend. Not because I am asking, but because somewhere out there, someone is sitting in their own gilded cage, believing they are alone. This story could be the thing that reminds them they are not. And if you are not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Hit subscribe and tap that notification bell. New stories drop every week, and trust me, you do not want to miss what is coming next. Final closing statement. One last thing before you go. This content was carefully researched, crafted, and manually edited by our team. Every detail was chosen with intention. Every twist was designed with purpose. We do not create content just to fill your screen. We create stories that stay with you, stories that make you think, stories that carry meaning and lessons you can actually use in your own life. Because in a world full of noise, we believe you deserve something real. Thank you for watching until the very end. That means more than you know. I will see you in the next one.